University of Maryland. I think many of our programs have had courses that related to what's called evidence and data and quantitative methods and things over the years. We've heard from some of the employers today how important those skills are when they're looking at people and what they need in their offices. We're hoping to hear from today's panelists a little bit more how we go about doing that, or maybe more detail on what is in fact needed in this world. I'm going to ask each of the panelists, before we actually hear the individual presentations, to briefly introduce how they come at this subject and just like a two-sentence capsule of what they are going to say so we can put the individual talks in a context as we hear them. Beginning with you, Bob Goerge.
So I come at this from working nearly 30 years with extremely large data sets. I never use the term big data because of all the issues around what that means. But we've been at the place I work, Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago, been using administrative data for 30 years from various state agencies and have been putting those together. So for the past 15 years, I've been trying to convince the folks at the Harris School for Public Policy Studies at the University of Chicago to create a program where we would teach students how to prepare data. None of us learned that in our regular social science or public policy PhD programs, or certainly master's programs, and some of us don't even learn it in our PhD programs and rely on others to provide us with the data sets that we use. But as we, for both research purposes, but in this case mostly for the great demand that exists in now in the public sector for individuals who understand both public policy and IT issues. We developed this Master's of Science program in Computational Analysis and Public Policy. So the demand is really to create our next generation of Chief Information Officers, Chief Data Officers, Chief Technology Officers at all levels of government, municipal, state, and federal. These positions are being developed. Part of the reason for creating these people is for people like us to hire them and be able to create our data sets and to understand not only how to program it, but also the business that we're trying to do in our research. Also, there's a great demand for consultants. I'm afraid that most of our graduates are going to go work for Accenture or McKinsey and not in the public sector positions that I'd like them to work with. So we have many programs teaching data science right now. They're popping up like tulips in springtime. Often they're one-year programs. Often they're online programs. NYU has one. Northwestern has one. We can go on forever. They're not. They teach the skills. They teach the basic skills, the data analytics. Data analytics. There's the course, the database course. But they really don't get into combining that with the substantive knowledge of public policy. So what we did was we combined both. We took parts of the MPP program, the Harris School, and we went to our colleagues in the Department of Computer Science and asked them what was important for they have a one-year professional master's program. We put most of the parts of that program and put it into the MPP curriculum and came up with the Master's of Science program. So it's a collaboration. That's not spring 2003, it's spring 2013. It's a collaboration with the School of Public Policy and the Department of Computer Science, which is the Physical Science Division, which has its own interesting issues, how different schools work. Public Policy provides the administrative support. We also have a Center for Urban Center for Computation and Data at our Computation Institute. So that already brings social scientists and computer scientists together. So a lot of research happens at that Urban CCD Center, and we have faculty leads in both partner organizations. This is our curriculum. We still have first quarter is still statistics, and second quarter is primarily more econometric methods, and we still have microeconomics in the first 2 quarters. We dropped some of the political economy classes, but they have a full year of computer science where they learn Java, Python, Hadoop, MapReduce, everything they need to prepare to do almost anything in the computer science programming world. We have a brand new class that's Introduction to Data Analytics. That's the only class that's not being taught by a senior faculty member. We thought we'd get somebody from the real world to teach data analytics. So we actually have practitioners, which I have 3 different practitioners who are going to be teaching that class. The internship is really, I'll talk a little bit about internship in a few minutes. The second year, we do get a couple political science classes in there and a database class. In the second year, we will have a capstone class. We don't have to worry about that yet. We're only starting this year. In the first year, we will have an integrated seminar where we'll put together new projects relative to public policy using the skills that students have learned in the first 2 quarters. So one of the special things is that the students in our CAP program will have a PhD student TA on the computer science side of things to address their needs specifically. Some students, we didn't require any of the students to have a CS or programming background. We just expected them to have really high test scores and the willingness to do this. High quantitative test scores. But some are coming with the programming backgrounds, and they may test out of the classes, and we'll send them to other classes. In the second year, they're going to specialize in 2 different ways: either a particular area of policy, energy education, whatever the school offers. They'll have enough electives to get into that into a certain degree, or we've had some interest in wanting to get into more deeply into different data collection methods. Those people want to combine survey methods with administrative data issues, advanced data analytics, or even take classes at the law school and learn more about privacy and those types of things. Internship is really, from my point of view, the key to integrating the statistics and the data analytics classes. We have already about 3 internship requests for every student we're going to accept. We have government, not-for-profits, and private firms working with the public sector. Right now we have organizations from coast to coast that want to have one of these students. We also had a seminar this year in order to bring together the 2 faculties, in order to have them start speaking the same language and understanding each other. Well, we expect to have that same issue next year, but next year we're going to bring speakers from policy settings who are already doing work like this. We may be video conferencing them from other places to talk about these issues, but we really want both the faculty and the students to understand the overlap of these issues and the importance. And we already have, at the university, we already have a dozen faculty using computational methods to address public policy issues. Mostly younger faculty who've picked this up along the way, doing a lot of data mining, text mining, web scraping, all those types of new methods. We originally expected we had with 5 students. We got over 100 applications. I'd say 70 of them were really good. So we accepted 25. And in a regular MPP class, at least at the Harris School, we usually get a 25% yield rate. And then over summer we lose a few and we replace them. We already have a 50% yield rate, and the deadline is this week. So we don't know what we're going to do with some of these students. So there's more information. That's our website, my email, wish me luck. We're going to try to make everybody happy. And they're actually, we have, our visit day was yesterday and today. Usually we get about 80% of those people who visit, and we have 12 students there, so we think we're over the top on how many students we need.
I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions for you. We'll come back. Most impressive, I think, is you've been going for almost 2,000 years now, according to your first slide. Very full cycle.
Give or take.
We'd be meeting this. Very good. Our next panelist has been Anand Desai from the Glenn School at Ohio State University. Again, if you would start out just kind of saying where you're coming from for this whole thing and how you come to this issue, and the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you. This is something that David Andersen and I were both going to present together. David has the fortune of spending his daughter's 35th birthday with the rest of his family today, and so he chose to do something other than be here. So that's where he is. But this is, unlike both the other presentations, I think mine is more of an opinion piece rather than a research finding or a discussion of a particular program. What David and I have been thinking about is a lot of essentially, to put it in its most negative sense, to how to get around the monopoly of statistics in our programs. And so that's where we are coming from. And so what I want to do is to divide up what I want to say into three different topics. One is, and fortunately because these terms have become so popular, one is to talk about evidence and evidence-based practice and so forth. The second is about big data. And then third, I want to do is to talk about tools. So to talk about evidence, evidence is, we are in the business of bringing about change as policy people in terms of practitioners or in terms of policy makers. And we want to do is to be able to support decision making for the people who make these decisions and who want to bring about change. And most of the time we are dealing with wicked problems. And so as you go from one session to another, we hear about complex problems and so forth. And the question then is, how do you take those wicked problems and then say, what is the evidence that we are going to need to be able to say that if we are going to make these changes, that we have sufficient evidence to say that changes have happened. And so the question then is, where do we link the wicked problem to the evidence? And so one way to think about this is, whenever you have a wicked problem, you are essentially have some sense of what would be a desired outcome. The problem is a wicked problem only because somebody has decided that it is unsatisfactory. So we want to be able to characterize what is unsatisfactory about it, bring our values to it, because that is going to then tell us what is a satisfactory solution. Because what is satisfactory depends entirely on what values we deem important. And so characterizing that wicked problem in the context of those values, and then saying those values have these attributes which can be measured in this way, and then that tells us the kinds of data we are going to need to be able to bring some decision support for the wicked problems. So we can come down from the wicked problems to the kinds of data we need. Secondly, if we have data, what we want to be able to say is, how do we organize them, how do we massage them, manipulate them, and I use those things not in a derogatory manner, I mean it in a professional, proper manner, to create the kinds of information and knowledge that you would need to be able to create that evidence. So from the bottom up, from data you need to get the evidence. From the top down, from the wicked problem, you need evidence that you're going to use. And so what we would like to be able to talk about is to help our students think through the problem design, the problem formulation part. What does that mean in terms of measurement? What does that mean in terms of attributes? What does that mean in terms of values? And how do you incorporate these kinds of things in your data analysis so that you can then, at the end of the day, say, we have some credible evidence to suggest that this is how we are going to make sense of this wicked problem. So that's one, this whole question of how you're going to formulate the wicked problem into a research studyable exercise. A lot of what Bob presented regarding the data and making sense of data, one of the things we have focused a lot on is statistical data analysis in our classes. But that assumes a well-defined population and a well-defined sample, and the inference engine is very well defined there too, as that you're going to have a sample, you're going to have a population, you can infer from the sample to the population in a legitimate statistical fashion, and that's what all our tools are designed to do. We now have administrative data, which for all practical purposes are population data. So the error structure of administrative data is fundamentally different from the error structure of sample data. We also have data that are picked up through all kinds of tools and techniques, crowdsourcing, visual recognition, and so forth. And so there we have tremendous amounts of data, which for marketing purposes is fine, because all you need to know is if you want to sell soap to somebody, you can tell who's buying which kind of soap and you can get that. But if you're going to make public policy, then you need to have some connection between the sample of data that you have, which is copious in the case of crowdsourcing and so forth, and the policies that you need to make, which have to work for the whole population. So the error structure of data that are automatically collected or crowdsourced or whatever is very different from the error structure of a sample properly designed by the Bureau of Labor Statistics or the Census Bureau and so forth, which is very different from the. So one of the things we have to explain to our students is to understand that you cannot slap all of these things into a regression and run a regression and then say at a 5% level of significance this makes sense of everything. That is sheer idiocy, and we should recognize that. We should not propagate that. And so how do we make sense of those kinds of analyses is something that we also need to pay attention to, both as researchers and as teachers. And then the third thing I wanted to talk about is that because of this tremendous growth and change in the information technology that we have access to, we are no longer bound by the approximations that Gauss had to make when he was computing things by hand. We can now, in a trice almost, show what the distribution of whatever data that we are looking at. And so we don't have to make any assumptions about whether it follows a t distribution or an f distribution or a normal distribution to design our tests. We can come up with a picture of our data, and then we can decide where do we want to stand in front of 20 people and say, I'm going to defend my action on the basis of this is where I see my data, and then I want to go ahead and make my decisions based on a 10% level of confidence, or 50% level of confidence, or a 5% level of confidence. So this whole question of how we go about making use of visualization, how we go about making use of the way in which we can use splines and so on and so forth to simply get some sort of a pattern out of the data. And then if those patterns lend themselves to statistical analysis, then by all means we can bring the statistical testing to that. But most of the statistical tests were designed for small samples. They don't and should not be used for large samples of data. So from a statistical point of view, we can start taking advantage of the technology that we have to make sense of the data through visualization, through various different types of analysis. We now can also develop all kinds of simulations where instead of looking at relationships between variables, we look at interactions between entities. So agent-based modeling allows you to study relationships between individuals, between policies, between institutions, and do that in a spatial as well as a chronologically differentiated fashion. And so those types of models study how these entities interact with each other. We can explore the rules by which these entities interact with each other. We can explore the rules by which these rules can be allowed to change. So what that allows us to do is to explore a variety of different scenarios. So rather than say, here is my forecast, here is my projection, we can say, here is our understanding of how people perceive the world. Given that perception of the world, this is its implementation in a computer program in some sort of a simulation. So first of all, what one can do in terms of validation and verification is to say, do the products of the simulation exercise agree with your intuition? If it does, that's fine. If it doesn't, then either the modeling is wrong or the intuition is wrong. And so then we can discuss how and when are you going to update your intuition, or how are you going to update your model. So the simulation kinds of exercises allow you to do that. At the micro level and at the macro level, you can have various types of system dynamics models. And that gets into taking a very different perspective of things in terms of looking at things from as a systems perspective, and rather than trying to reduce things down to their components and then trying to see how those things make sense. So in a variety of different ways, if we are going to be seriously taking advantage of all the computational power that we have, we need to be able to make much better sense of how we obtain our data and decide what we mean by high quality versus poor quality data. How are we going to store those data? How are we going to retrieve those data? How are we going to make sense of those data in terms of underlying patterns and so forth? Whatever, and then we have a whole range of tools and techniques that are available to us. And now softwares are being developed that you don't have to really understand many of how these tools work. You can have all these drop-down menus, so which is both a good thing and a bad thing. But one can be systematic in the ways we go about doing that. And then eventually we have to be able to make sense of what is the kind of inference we are going to draw. Because just now we don't really think about the causation and the inference engine that is driving the kinds of recommendations we come up with. And we were at the lunch, we were talking about you need to be able to go back and forth between the people you're serving as well as your own understanding of things. And so there was this whole question of I think the terms you used were, you may say whatever you want to, but what did the people hear? And so this gives you a formal way in which you can sort of formalize the model structure in such a way that you can say, this is how we modeled it. Is that your understanding of the system? If not, let us revise that. And so it then becomes a collaborative process between the researchers and the people who are going to be using the products of the research. And our students have to understand those kinds of things. So how we go about organizing these courses, this is probably not a single course that I'm talking about. It is a whole different way of thinking about evidence, thinking about data, thinking about the knowledge we draw from these data, and then how are we going to use that and the sense we are going to make of these various types of information, just not numerical information. It can be sound, it can be visual, it can be numerical, it can be text, and so forth. So that's all.
Thank you, Dr. Next, we're going to hear from Cynthia Osborne from the LBJ School in Texas, and I believe she comes at it from, gee, I wish people knew this perspective.
Yes. Good afternoon, and thanks for staying through the end. So I'm motivated to do this work for two reasons, really. One, like you said, I have been working with large administrative data for several years now, and when my students come to me, and even when I first started, I really had no idea how messy and just a hot mess it really is. And so I want my students to know all this before they can come and work with me. But then secondly, we're training leaders to go out and make good decisions in government and other entities later on. And so I'm hoping that they bring us better data in the future. So that's kind of my dual approach. And also a disclaimer is that I don't teach this class. This is kind of a wish list that the person who actually works for me, managing my data right now, and I kind of devised. And we thought, well, we'll share it with you guys and get your feedback on it, but I might be preaching to the choir here. And just as a little side note, she actually has a history background, not high math test scores, but this is something that she was really interested in and was able to really succeed at. So just to clarify a little bit more about what I do, I'm a professor at LBJ School, but I also run what's called the Child Family Research Partnership. So we do a lot of policy work, evaluation work for various state agencies, including the Child Support Division, Health and Human Services, and their early childhood interventions, namely home visiting. And I did a 2-year project with our state education agency, which I survived, but I won't go back to those data again, I promise. But so, again, we use this large-scale administrative data as kind of the heart of all of our work. And it's important for our students not to just, understand kind of for my purposes, but they are going to go out and use larger data, as you were just saying. This is kind of the bulk of the way that we're thinking about data-driven decision-making now and evidence-based policy-making. So I think it's important for them to know. So I argue that in addition to, not in place of, but in addition to the rigorous statistical analysis and other things that you were just talking about that all of our students really need to know, that we also believe that they need just a basic understanding of statistical programs. This sounds, again, like it should be kind of a no-brainer, but even down to the point of why you don't put knowledge of Excel on your resume, what signal that sends, or SPSS, what that sends kind of a negative signal to some people. You're not a sophisticated data analyst. So what's the difference between Stata and SAS, and when would you use these statistical programs? And they really don't, this is not something that you just learn by osmosis, and we have to be more explicit about this. And then preliminary kind of basic understanding of database management, which I'll get to a little bit more in our third kind of wish list, or item on our wish list. But we really want to make sure our students know what data do we need, kind of what's missing there, what do we actually need. How good is it when it comes to us, and I learn to be skeptical of the data that we have. To understand that the world isn't flat, that this is something that we are usually teaching them, that the world comes in a nice, pretty flat file that's ready for them to analyze, to think about how to link data across different agencies and within an agency, and then kind of rounding out and overriding all of these is how to deal with this issue of data security. So the framework that we have for kind of presenting these different competencies, and these are our kind of top 5, we could probably think of several more, but is to identify what the problem is as we see it, to use some examples from the work that we've done so that students really get the sense of what we're talking about, and then to think about what the challenges and needs are for teaching this, and provide some specific recommendations when we can. And I just, as a side note, did not see Trevor's big data talk today, so I hope I don't contradict anything that you say or that so I apologize for that. Here, it was very good. So I think that the first thing that I wish all students understood is that we need to move from collecting data from compliance to collecting data for accountability and decision making. That almost all administrative data has been collected based on compliance. It's what they have to report to the feds. It's what they have to report to their funding agency. In Texas, almost all data are legislatively mandated. That if the state legislature did not say that you can collect this, you cannot collect it. And it is a very, very, very long process to put one additional data point on collecting something from our state schools, for instance. And there's issues of privacy and there's issues of big government and all of that. But we don't necessarily collect the data points that we need. 2 examples of this. In our child support division, for instance, we do know how much you owe and how much you pay in child support. So we know whether what you're supposed to pay and what you do pay. But we don't know some basic things like, well, how much do you actually make? And that would seem like something one would want to know in your data on collecting child support. And it's in your, court record somewhere, but it doesn't make it up into the administrative records. They're trying to layer that in a little bit more now. But it wasn't something that they were asked to collect previously. So when we are using their data to help them more effectively run their operations and to target who they can collect it from and who they can't collect it from, we can't answer the basic question of who's more likely to pay, at what income level are people more likely to pay and not pay. So as you know, this doesn't even pass the duh test in my estimation, but it is a reality. And Texas is not the only state for whom this is a reality. I mean, Texas, you know, we're Texas. You know, we like to do things differently, but we are not alone here. Likewise, Texas schools, just like almost all other schools across the country, the state agencies did not collect a link between the students and the teachers. And you were talking about doing this value added, and this is the time in which they started to do this with these state longitudinal data systems that the feds paid a lot of money for them to create. But before that, that wasn't something that the state level ever thought that they would need. Why would I need to know which teacher the student actually had and how they progressed over time versus students who had these other sorts of teachers? That wasn't even something on their mind because all they've been doing is reporting for compliance. So, you know, obviously students need to understand how expensive it is, both financially and politically, to add in new data points, but to also understand that without it, we really can't do the research that we need. But what's important is that too often in our statistics courses, we teach them how to do the analysis, but what we learn at the doctoral level is why we're doing the analysis and why we include certain data points over other data points. And our master's level students need a little of this as well. They need to understand kind of a theoretical framework that guides your evaluation and your research. Theory tells you what data you're going to need. And we leave that out in too many of our courses, in my estimation. So my hope is that you know, as our students move into these positions of authority, that they're going to be able to, you know, advocate for having the right measures in. But we'll see if that actually, how long that will take. So I think this is consistent with the talk this morning on big data, but I think a lot of my students have been pretty convinced that if it's in the administrative data, it is what it is. And like you were saying, this is our population, right? So this is kind of everyone. And we have been shocked by some of the poor quality of data. And again, this isn't just in Texas, this is kind of everywhere. But in the first year that we collected the student-teacher link, the districts were not provided real guidance on how to deal with things like when there's team teaching or when a student, you know, spends half that class in that room and half that class in another room and so forth. There was not clear guidance, but they were starting to use these data for accountability purposes, even though the data were not accurate, right? We have another thing here when we're evaluating our home visiting programs. These are what I call my Mary Poppins home visitors. You know, our data system right now tells us that, for instance, we just picked out this one, it's one of our favorites. You know, this woman works across 2 different home visiting programs in 3 different counties. That's not true, right? That's not possible. She's not Mary Poppins. She doesn't just fly in and, like, you know, go in and help someone and fly out. But this is what the data say. And so when we're starting to use it for accountability and evaluation purposes without really understanding and someone being accountable for making it clean, you know, we can't do our work very well. What we've also found is kind of underlying some of this problem is that our programmers, and I'm sure you guys are going to put this in your new program, the programmers are good at programming. They're really good at building these databases. They are not good at being able to check quality control and to understand that we don't have Mary Poppins. Like, that shouldn't exist, right? Well, that one's pretty obvious. They should have found that one anyway. But, you know, that's not their framework. So now we've developed a situation where we work with their kind of, you know, CS folks, folks who know how to program it. We have the substantive knowledge, and so we're involved really closely in the quality control process. It wasn't something that we budgeted initially. I've had to basically put a whole FTE on this, but if I don't have clean data, I can't do my analysis. So I'm willing to eat whatever I have to in order to make it have clean data. But anyway, the other thing that too often our students don't quite get is the difference between research and kind of accountability work. So the most obvious example of this was in the value-added work. I would, work with all these great guys who are doing this high-level statistical analysis, creating value-added models for teacher effectiveness. And, we would talk through, like, okay, well, tell me about your sample. And they would just take the cleanest sample that they could have. If that person didn't have prior test scores, they threw them out of the sample. If they didn't have a clean student-teacher link, they threw them out. They were doing an analytic thing, and the consequence was whether it got published or not published, right? We couldn't do that. Every teacher had to be linked back, had to be linked forward to all their students and linked back to where they were trained. And these schools of education were going to either stay accredited or not based on the quality of the graduates' influence on student achievement. So we had to include all 6 million kids and all 300,000 teachers. We weren't allowed to just throw them out. And there's a big difference between those two things. And so we have to help our kids, we have to help our students really understand the difference between research for accountability and decision making versus just research for publication. But anyway, our recommendation is that we really need our students not to just work on clean analytic files. They need to see that the data are really dirty. They need to identify and find those problems. And be challenged about what to do with it. Do you throw these out? Do you keep them in? Do you report kind of iffy results, or do you say, I can't give you anything on that? So the third, and I'm sorry if I'm taking, I'll rush through this one especially because I think that it kind of just speaks for itself. But I actually kind of thought that the world was flat for a long time. I knew that there was this thing called relational databases. That wasn't something that I was ever going to have to know about or do anything about. And lo and behold, asking an agency to send you a flat file with rows and columns is well, that's a 6-month thing. That's going to take my program or whatever it's going to take. And, it doesn't really. I mean, the code is not that difficult to do now that we have to do it. But that's just not the way that they think about it, because they have their databases set up for compliance, basically. So this is what TEA, our education agency, sent to us to this is, obviously you're not supposed to be able to read this. It's just one example of part of what they sent to us. There are lines connecting all these different things to show us how some of their tables are set up together so that how we're going to have to merge them and so we can come up with a flat file. This was, I think, in their way to tell us, see, this is why it's going to be so hard for us to do it, why it's going to take us, a year to get it to you. Anyway, we ended up getting just the tables and learn SQL. It was a lot faster than a year to wait for them. But it is, it's not, we usually don't understand how complex our data are. This is something that we created just so we could wrap our head around our home visiting database. And so anyway, just our recommendation is not that they have to learn SQL, but they have to understand that data don't come just in rows and columns. And that informs the analysis that you can do. You can do more sophisticated analysis with relational databases, but it also, is a different sort of shape of your data and what you have to do with it. The fourth piece is this really important issue. And this is actually something I hope that when they go out into the world, they make it better for all of us. It's the idea about linking data sets. And we've tried in multiple examples to try to link our data from one data set to another. And some are very successful. The child support data, they can link to the workforce. They know if you're working. They don't know how much you're making, but they know that you're working, and then it's the employer's responsibility to take out X amount of money out of your paycheck. So boy, do they get a flag fast if you enter the workforce. They also have to link them to vital statistics because if you have an unmarried birth, they are legislatively responsible for making sure that you establish paternity. We've had to work with our home visiting folks. We have to identify if anyone has maltreatment, any child is a victim of maltreatment. So we've had to work in a secure way with our Department of Family and Protective Services to help us understand who those kids are. But these agencies agencies do not use the same identifier. Everyone has their own agency ID. And sometimes they have it linked back to a social, but it is not an easy, the person who holds that key to that crosswalk is not in the building. I do not know where this person always lives. It is not easy to always get it linked back in that way. So it's important, to really understand that this is not just a simple process to merge across. Even within agencies, and I'm really calling out TEA here because they're just bad in this way. I'm sure they're not the only ones, but at the school level, at the district level, at the state level, and in each database they're in, every student has a different ID. I mean, one student has a different ID in all those. So a particular student can have something like 12 different IDs. And again, trying to make a link back up and combine those data sets, no one ever does it because they don't have to. They're all doing it for compliance. And so the importance of having a unique identifier that on one hand allows for the combining of data, but also keeps folks' identity secure. It's a challenge, but it's also a necessity. Ideally, each person would have their own unique identifier that's well known to them, so that it's unique to them, but it's well known, so they can use it across agencies, like a social security number, but that raises big issues of privacy and so forth. But at least within an organization, there should be one identifier. But we need our students to learn how to merge these folks. And we're merging on names and date of births and addresses and zip codes. And, we're talking about kids who are victims of maltreatment. And there's a lot of, Bobby Smiths or whatever in Texas. And this is, the strategies to do this are getting better, but we need to develop better strategies and to teach them to our students. Anyway, I'll just finish with data security and what I teach everyone who works with me is that it is the kind of most important thing about working with data. That we want our students to understand that we're actually working with individuals' lives, that they've kind of entrusted us with a little piece of their identity and about them, especially when we're doing survey data. And that we treat all of our data as if it is their social security number, even though we do some special stuff with that, kind of hidden away as much as we possibly can, and only work on what we call de-identified data. But even there, we treat it as if it's identifiable. It's still very secure. It's still limited access. But then there's also this tension between keeping everything really secure and being able to actually use it. And so there's strategies that we can develop to balance that tension. So I'll stop there so that we can have more discussion. But again, this is kind of a selfish push so that students coming to work for me have a better understanding of all of these things, and so that our students can kind of go out in the world and make it different, so we get cleaner data when they get in positions of leadership.
Okay, thank you very much. The 12 IDs remind me of a Russian novel, right? Where everybody, you can't really follow the story because they're all by different names. It does sound like one of the key lessons to come out of, from our panelists here is that it's important for our students to spend time not just on how you do data analysis when everything's right, when the sample is normal, when and you have the right number and things like that, but perhaps even more important, because they're more going to be consumers of these of data than they are going to be producers of it.
Right. That
it's more important for them to be able to quickly see and look or ask the right questions. More important, are there missing variables here that correlate with things? How is the data collected? What's missing? Sort of thing from it. Does causation truly flow in only one direction here? Or does it go both ways? What should have been done under those sort of circumstances? So.